Hey everybody, so I made a first impressions video a little bit ago after playing Tears of the Kingdom for about a weekend, and I mostly just focused on how much better I think the new abilities are in this game compared to the old abilities from Breath of the Wild, and I didn't touch on much else. Well, now I've put in over a week's worth of gameplay and who knows how many more hours into the game now, so I figured that now was a good time to put out a second impressions video, for lack of a better term. I'm going to continue to try and avoid as many spoilers as possible, but in order to keep talking about more of the game, I'm going to have to talk about, well, more of the game. So I'll avoid discussing anything directly about the story and things like that, but I will have to talk about various aspects of the gameplay that you might otherwise be discovering on your own over time. So if you want to avoid as many spoilers as possible and just want my more general thoughts on Tears of the Kingdom, feel free to check out my actual first impressions video, which I'll link in the cards in the description. But for this video, I will continue to try and be as vague as possible, and it's not like I'm planning on giving away any kind of puzzle solutions or anything like that. So, to give an update as to where I am actually in the game. Like I said, in my previous video, I had only played for about a weekend and I had only completed a single one of the game's dungeon equivalents. Now, at this point, I've gone to each of the four main regions, the Rito and the Gerudo and so on, and I've completed all of their relevant dungeons, and I've also completed the Lost Woods as well, for any kind of implications you might be able to derive from that. But I think that the dungeons are a great place to start with talking about this game, because that's probably one of the biggest points of contention that people had with Breath of the Wild. And I'm very happy to say that the dungeons feel so much better than they did in the last game. So right up front, it's worth pointing out that the core dungeons are technically structured in a similar way to how Breath of the Wild's dungeons were formatted. You still have a central area in the dungeon where you start, and you get the map, and then you have to reach a varying number of key points by solving various puzzles in order to unlock the boss door and fight the boss. However, I don't think that this formula was ever really the main problem that people had with Breath of the Wild's dungeons. It was mostly everything else around them. In Breath of the Wild, all the dungeons had the exact same art style and tended to blend in with each other, even if they did have wildly different puzzles in each of them. Additionally, I would argue that the dungeons actually start before you get to the Divine Beasts, and you can easily include the quests you have to do just to be able to access the beasts as kind of part of the dungeon, at least in a more abstract sense. The problem was that those quests were also fairly uninspired at the end of the day, and usually boiled down to a fairly simple task you had to complete, followed by a boss fight where you had to take on the beast itself before you actually enter the beast proper. For example, the Rito dungeon, all you really had to do was complete a basic paragliding and bow shooting minigame at the flight range, which, to be fair, acted as a tutorial for then the boss fight you had to do where you were fighting the divine beasts using the wind and Teba and everybody, and then you would enter the beast for the actual main meat of the dungeon that most people talk about. And then, of course, the other big issue that people bring up was that the actual boss of every divine beast was just some variation on a generic Ganon-Blight monster that, again, while they all technically had different abilities and were very different fights, they easily blended together visually and thematically, which kind of made them a lot more boring than they should be. Now, however, the dungeons in Tears of the Kingdom are way more interesting and cool, in my opinion, especially when you take into account the things leading up to them. Now, each dungeon generally has some kind of grander challenge leading up to them. In the Rito dungeon, to try and compare things more directly, and without giving too much away, you have to complete this big traversal challenge where you're climbing higher and higher into the air by gliding and using your new ability that you get for that dungeon, and that's actually something that Breath of the Wild also didn't do either. In classic Zelda games, you would get some kind of new tool or ability in the dungeon, which would then be the key to completing various challenges and puzzles, ultimately culminating in a boss fight where you take down the boss using that new ability to your advantage. Now, this can get pretty formulaic if it's overdone or not done very well, but there's a reason why it was done so much in all these classic games. It's because it makes it so that the dungeon itself can act as a very natural tutorial to help introduce that new ability, and then you can bring it with you for the rest of the game with a better understanding of how it works. And that formula works really well in a game where you can complete any dungeon in any order and use those abilities all over the world for various kinds of puzzle solving. So, I'm glad that Tears of the Kingdom actually returns to that kind of formula and actually gives you your new ability at the start of the dungeon instead of only as a reward for completing it. And then that ability gets reinforced throughout the dungeon as a tool to complete it. And then finally, you can use that ability during the boss fight itself to give you an edge to defeat them, as opposed to only getting your new ability as a reward for beating the boss after you've already finished the dungeon completely. And it was actually this aspect that led to a more subtle problem in Breath of the Wild, in my opinion, where while the puzzles were different in each of the Divine Beasts, they were all forced to use the same basic mechanics, because they only gave you your abilities after you beat the dungeon, which meant that they had to be beatable with only your default kit and nothing else, because they couldn't guarantee that you would have any other powers before you reached them. So, they still had to all use your basic 4 abilities, your bombs, your magnesis, that kind of stuff, as puzzle elements, whereas now, since you get your ability much earlier on in the dungeon, the puzzles and challenges that you face, and especially the boss fight, are able to actually account for that new ability, if not downright require you to use it to progress. And if you define the start of the dungeon as when you first get access to that new ability, then some of the dungeon challenges in this game are really wild. Like, I personally think that the Gerudo dungeon, again, without giving too much away, is a particular standout in that it is wildly different from basically anything else I've done in a Zelda game before. I really thought that mission was super fun, and I honestly wish that it was longer and crazier, although the boss fight, I'll admit, was actually pretty insane and hectic at the end of the day. Oh yeah, and speaking of bosses, I think I can happily say that we got no more Ganon Blights. Yeah, all the bosses are actual unique things for you to fight and take down, and the general theming of each dungeon is completely wholly unique from one another. So no more of this ubiquitous art style theming that permeates all of them simultaneously. And I'm very glad to say that not only are the dungeon abilities and puzzles more unique, but so are the themings of all the boss fights and generally just everything about them. Although, I will say that, as is Zelda tradition, my least favorite dungeon is, of course, the water-themed one. But hey, at least you get to interact with Sidon again, so I know that that'll let people overlook just about anything. So yeah, it's also worth saying that the rewards for completing the dungeons also feel way better and better designed to me compared to the ones you got from Breath of the Wild. They could be a little awkward to use at times, I will admit, but overall the reward was so cool that once I realized not only what the rewards you get from completing dungeons was, but also what the nature of gaining multiple of these rewards from the different dungeons was, I immediately decided that I wanted to complete all of the dungeons as soon as possible instead of spreading them out throughout my gameplay, so that I could amass and use these rewards as much as possible while I was beating the rest of the game. I'll admit that they can be a little bit awkward, like I said before, but overall, I think they're way cooler than the rewards in Breath of the Wild. Even if, technically speaking, the rewards in Breath of the Wild were probably a lot more powerful, such as things like Mipha's Grace able to revive you and giving you extra hearts and things like that. It's also worth pointing out that you're able to use the rewards much more regularly than the older abilities. There's no more like 30-minute long cooldowns that you have to wait for once you've used up a power's limited uses or anything silly like that. So that's just a nice change that you can actually use these abilities much more regularly. There are still cooldowns, of course, but they're like 10 seconds long instead of half an hour. But yeah, there are also lots of other great aspects of this game that I want to touch on as well beyond the dungeons. For one, there is the addition of a very distinct hub town to this game, which I think is really interesting. Now, sure, in Breath of the Wild, you could probably use just about any town you wanted as a hub, but not many places in that game would have, like, actually everything that you would want in one place. So you'd probably have to hop around from place to place to get access to all of the shops that you want in order to check in and restock everything before resuming on your adventure. But now, right away, pretty much right after you finish the tutorial, you're introduced to a sort of hub city in a very centralized location that pretty much all of your basic amenities that you could want, ranging from shops to a goddess statue to beds and other new things that are unique to this game, are all in one place. Plus, it also gets upgraded over time as you complete various objectives and gets even more amenities added to it. And there's a ton of quest givers in this area to kind of help direct you in case you need some guidance on which part of the world that you should be exploring if you want to just follow the quest lines and whatnot instead of just going out on your own. So it helps provide some guidance for new players as well. I think it's just a nice quality of life change that it's also pretty fun to revisit time and time again as you progress through the game and watch it change and grow as you save more and more of the people of Hyrule. And speaking of revisiting places, another big thing that I like in this game is that it doesn't really make you repeat much of anything that you did in the previous game. For example, you might go to Goron City and immediately assume, oh, I've got to go catch fire lizards and such so that I can do the same thing I did in Breath of the Wild. Or you go to the Lost Woods remembering the trick from the previous game to try and navigate it, and so you might try doing the same thing again. And I really like that they didn't just take the easy way out and go, oh yeah, you could just use the same tricks all over again to access these areas, and instead they remixed them all to be different in new and interesting ways, so that you have to approach these new areas in different ways than you did before, even if you're familiar with the tricks that you had to use in Breath of the Wild. So yeah, and in regards to the Ultra Hand sort of building aspect of the game, one other thing I want to comment on real quick is that I was actually surprised at just how much variety there is to the Zonai devices that you can find in the game. Those are the things like the car tires and the fans that you can assemble in order to build vehicles and contraptions that they showed off in the trailers. And based on what they showed in the trailers, I mostly expected it to be fairly basic without much going on. Just kind of the basic things you would need to build like vehicles and solve a few simple puzzles, but at the end of the day, there are actually some really cool and unique devices that I did not expect to see, with some of them being super esoteric and niche, but potentially used for some really fun and interesting builds. I personally love designing and building various turrets that would aid me in attacking enemies mid-combat, and things like that to live out my sort of D&D artificer fantasies in an actual action game. And there's so many other things that you can do with them that I'm sure people will post about endlessly online. Finally, one more thing that I want to talk about for this game in this video is that I think it's going to be a lot easier to 100% the shrines due to the structure of the game. There's a really cool aspect to the shrines that isn't really obvious at first that I will try to not spoil the nature of. But basically, the way they work and interact with the world has a cool side effect where, essentially, as you start to get further into the game like I have, it becomes very clear where the shrines you haven't found yet might be, which I think will greatly help people find and beat all of them this time around, even though there are even more shrines to complete in this game compared to Breath of the Wild. The trait that I'm talking about isn't really obvious at first, which is why I'm trying to avoid spoiling it. And I don't think I've even seen an NPC explain it to me. It's just kind of something you have to figure out on your own. But it's a really neat aspect to the game, and now I'm really looking forward to trying to actually find and beat every single shrine that there is, which is something I didn't actually manage to do in Breath of the Wild, despite playing through that game all the way through twice. So yeah, the more that I play this game and the deeper that I get into it, the more I love it. I really thought that it'd be hard to top Breath of the Wild for me, and I was afraid that this game would be fairly derivative of Breath of the Wild, but the more I explore and experience of this game, Breath of the Wild feels more like a prelude to this game. This game hasn't replaced Breath of the Wild in my opinion. It's still very much worth playing that game first before this one, as they are very inherently connected to each other. But this game is just so much more well refined. It takes Breath of the Wild's ideas and expands on them to such a high degree to make this game that is just so much bigger and better in just about every way that I can think of. Thanks to everybody for watching, and if you want to support the channel, likes and subscribers are the best way that you can do that, and that'll always help out. And I'm always happy to continue the conversation in the comments down below. I'm probably going to hold off on making any more videos about Tears of the Kingdom until I actually finally beat it. But I've been playing this game pretty consistently for over a week now, and I still feel nowhere clear of finishing it. So I'll probably make some other videos in the meantime whenever I can prime myself away from the game. But until then, I will see you guys later, because I'm going to go back to playing Zelda once this renders.